Welcome to the Kent ISD Literacy Leaders and Coaches Network Remote Edition. We are excited to bring you our 10th episode of the LLCN Brief. We appreciate those that are now following us on your preferred podcast outlet and excited to share that we now have about 1,400 unique listens to our previous 9 podcast episodes. These listens come from 16 different countries and 36 different states. We appreciate that you are finding value in the information we are making available for you. Thank you for continuing to share our message with those that you know will benefit from listening.
You asked, we listened. Based on your input from previous podcasts, this episode will explore the concept of formative assessment. My name is Sarah Shoemaker, and I am an early literacy coach at Kent ISD.
And I'm Mark Raffler. I'm the ELA and Social Studies consultant at the Kent ISD. The topic of assessment of and for student learning has long been prevalent in education conversations. The state of Michigan has been fortunate to have 2 groups supporting this conversation across the state. 2 groups that specifically come to mind supporting assessment are the Michigan Assessment Consortium, referred to as the MAC, and the Formative Assessment for Michigan Educators, or known as the FAME group. The question is, how do you utilize assessment in your work? Whatever your answer may be, this podcast is for you. We are asking questions on gathering and analyzing assessment data to assist in guiding instructional next steps.
Today, our guest, internationally recognized expert in formative assessment, Margaret Heritage, joins us for an in-depth exploration of this topic.
We are honored to have Margaret Heritage joining us today. Margaret, please take a moment to introduce yourself to our listening audience.
Well, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here. My name is Margaret Heritage. Currently, I am an independent consultant in education, formerly from UCLA, where I had 2 roles. The first was the principal of the Laboratory School of the Graduate School of Education Information Studies. And then my second role after that was to be the assistant director for professional learning at the National Center for Research on Evaluation Standards and Student Testing. Prior to that, my career began and continued till I moved to the US in the UK.
As a professor, author, researcher with many years of experience related to assessment, talk to us about formative assessment and ambitious teaching. What are the need to know pieces that all educators and students should have an understanding of?
Well, let me first begin by saying what I think ambitious teaching is. The idea of ambitious teaching arose several years ago in the context of pre-service education, typically around the time when the college and career ready standards were introduced, so that beginning teachers would have the competencies to be effective in their classrooms. And since then, I think because of the implementation of standards and the change from a more transmission model of teaching to one in which students are very much at the center, ambitious teaching has gained currency across the board. So, a few things to know about ambitious teaching. First of all, student thinking is at the center of the whole enterprise. So, it's really student focused and focused on thinking, the development of important concepts, analytical practices, and language needed to achieve the standards. Learning is social and interactive. So we've moved away from a situation where the teacher is doing all the talking in the classroom to where the students are engaged with each other and learning together. So that means they're oriented to work collectively, to listen to and speak with one another, and they engage with important ideas in the disciplines in multiple modes. In an formative assessment, I'll talk about that in just a second. But one of the things about ambitious teaching is that students are encouraged to share their provisional thinking, and teachers access that provisional thinking and build on it, both between interaction between the teacher and the student and with peers. And the students engage in rich use of disciplinary discourse. So, those are some of the characteristics of ambitious teaching. And ambitious teaching and the formative assessment process are very much reciprocal ideas. With student thinking at the center, ambitious teaching, the starting point for that teaching and for formative assessment is a shared understanding of the learning targets and the success criteria. And by that, I mean, what is it that students are going to learn? What are the important disciplinary ideas and practices they're going to engage in? And how will I, as a teacher, know, and how will they, as the students, know what it means to actually achieve that goal? And that's what we call the success criteria, the indicators of learning. Within teaching, there are multiple opportunities for eliciting evidence of student learning as they're engaging with these important disciplinary ideas through their tasks and activities and through discussion that they have with each other. And the teachers are consistently engaging with students, talking to them, questioning them, listening to what they have to say about the tasks they're involved in. So they're really getting a sense of how students are thinking so that they can act on that in the moment or as soon as possible in order to keep that learning moving forward. So the nature of the tasks that are part of ambitious teaching, the social and interactive learning, provide a forum also for formative assessment. And then the information that teachers gain from observing students, from listening to them, from questioning them, helps to fuel that ambitious teaching and keep learning moving forward.
So,
Yep.
really, ambitious teaching is about the constant engagement between the teacher and the students in the classroom to gauge where the student's understanding is and to build upon that to move the instruction forward in the classroom, which is
Yes.
likely to increase student engagement as well.
Absolutely, because what you're doing when you actually engage students in that way, you're building on where students actually are in their learning so that they can achieve success. You're not pitching the activity or the task to where you think the student should be, but rather you're working on the edge of their current competence so that they're continuously moving forward to meeting that goal.
It's that whole zone of proximal development.
Absolutely, that's what we're talking about.
We often get asked about the frequency of assessment. How often should formative assessment occur, and what should it look like?
I think, first of all, the important thing to understand about formative assessment, or as in Michigan, as it's referred to, the formative assessment process, it's not a separate test event like a benchmark test or an end of the year summative assessment. It's actually embedded into ongoing teaching and learning in the classroom. So I think it's important to separate it out. It's not that one kind of assessment's bad and the other's good, it's that assessment is used for different purposes. And formative assessment or the formative assessment process is used to acquire ongoing information about the status of learning while students are learning so that both teachers and students can keep moving that learning forward. It's not about what have students actually accomplished, but as a summative assessment would be, what have they actually achieved? But rather, where are they in their learning at this particular point as the lesson unfolds? And what do I, as a teacher, and the student, as the individual, need to do to advance that learning towards the goal? So, how often it should occur is really constantly. It's part of, I like to think of it as part of the DNA of the teaching and learning that, as I said earlier, it's reciprocal with ambitious teaching. So it's really embedded, integrated into ongoing teaching and learning. And when you ask what it should look like, well, if teachers are teaching ambitiously and students are learning ambitiously, there's plenty of opportunity in the lesson without having to develop a separate kind of assessment for teachers and students to judge or gauge where the student learning actually lies at a particular point in the lesson. So, for example, if you have a high quality learning task, then that should yield information as students are working through the completion of the task. Or if they're engaged in a high quality discussion, that you're able to externalize their thinking through what they say, you're able to make determinations about where you think the student learning, where their thinking currently is, and what to do next to advance it. So it really is, it's ongoing. And I know the teachers I've worked with over the years, both in the UK and the US, always say to me that the big difference in their teaching when they start to implement formative assessment in very clear and purposeful ways is that their teaching becomes much more intentional, because they're constantly acquiring evidence of how that learning is unfolding as the lesson evolves, and can keep it on track towards those lesson goals. Now, there's an Australian scholar, Patrick Griffin, who talks about how you are externalizing thinking, because that's basically what we're trying to do in formative assessment: externalize as far as possible how kids are thinking about the complex, rigorous, disciplinary ideas and practices we're engaging them with. We want to know how they're thinking about them. And what he says, it's gauged by what students say, do, make, or write. So, in ambitious teaching, the lesson design, the task design, the discussions, the questions are all part of that teaching plan. And when used intentionally by teachers to gain evidence to show how students are thinking, they can be used in ways that help teachers know what's next for students. So, I think it's really important to make that distinction between an assessment that is a thing, an assessment that is a process or a set of practices. I think the literature is pretty clear now. We talk about formative assessment as a set of practices which involve clear learning targets and success criteria, eliciting and interpreting evidence, acting on evidence, and the involvement of students through self assessment and peer feedback.
I appreciate, Margaret, you bringing up the fact the formative assessment process. We do have the Formative Assessment of Michigan Educators group here in Michigan, so appreciate the
Mhm.
reference to that and the work going on. And really like that you highlighted that idea of it being ongoing. I do think that's something, and having it be embedded into the teaching in the classroom. So formative assessment doesn't actually show itself. It's just a part of the way that we're going about that. And you use that term, the DNA of teaching and learning. That's a great quote for us to think about how it builds it up, because it really does guide our clear and purposeful actions, so that, as you said, we do that intentional teaching to move kids to those next steps.
Right. And the intentional evidence gathering, because you can plan all these high quality learning opportunities, but if you're not actively seeking out the evidence that's generated from them and using it, and of course, don't forget, you have to interpret the evidence against the criteria. That's why the criteria is so critical, because that's what you're actually looking for. I mean, if part of it, one of your criteria is to have students explain the relationship between X and Y, or justify a strategy, or identify and explain why a certain piece of evidence in a text supports a claim. You're going to be looking for that for the students. So it's really guiding your evidence collection, because that's what you're looking for: the success criteria, evidence of the success criteria. That's why it's so critical. In any assessment, there's a goal and there's performance indicators. And it just so happens in formative assessment, they're called success criteria. What will tell you and tell the students that they're making progress to meeting the goal?
In using formative assessment practices, we want to make sure our actions help close the gap between current understanding and where we want our students to be academically. Will you explain the role of clear learning goals and providing success criteria around those goals to get the most out of our formative assessment practices and processes?
Yes, let me start off with this notion of the gap. I want to be really clear what we mean by that. And the reason I want to be really clear is because I hear so much confusion out in the field about the gap. The notion of formative assessment in closing the gap comes from an Australian scholar, Roy Sadler, who wrote this seminal paper in 1989. And he talked about formative assessment as a feedback loop. And so basically, if you think about it in terms of implementation, We're working at the lesson level in formative assessment. And by a lesson, I mean 1, 2, 3 class periods. So they're short term, or Dylan William calls them short cycle assessments. And so the idea is that students begin a lesson with a certain degree of understanding, or maybe something that they're coming in from their home experience with to bring to the lesson. And we have a goal. We have a goal, or sometimes in Michigan in particular, they're called a target. So the goal, the target is, what is the learning you want the students to have actually accomplished around 1, 2, 3 class periods in this particular topic area. So if you think about where they begin and where you want them to end, there's a gap between the two, and there should be. This isn't the achievement gap. This isn't about subgroups performing less well than other groups. This is about the real gap between where kids start and where we want them to be in their learning at the end of the lesson. And so the whole idea of formative assessment, and as I said earlier, it's an ongoing process that teachers and students engage in to close that gap. And when teachers are interpreting evidence, they're really thinking about where is the student and what is the gap. Are they nearly there? Are they barely off the starting blocks? Are they partially there? What do I need to move them forward? Now, the clear learning targets and success criteria are essential to formative assessment. As I said earlier, learning goals and performance indicators are essential to any assessment. What is it that you're assessing? And what are the performance indicators that will tell you the degree to which students are performing at that level? And so in the past, I always refer to them as the drivers of the feedback loop. Teachers and students need to know what they're learning, why they're learning it, and then the success criteria, how they'll know if they've learned it. So that when they're planning the instructional activities, the instructional activities are clearly aligned to the learning goals. And then when teachers are looking in the lesson or listening in the lesson, they're looking for performance related to the success criteria. And as I said earlier, it's what students say, do, make, or write. And this is not just for teachers, it's also for students. Students, if we want students to be actively involved in their own learning, if we want them to engage in self-assessment, which I hope we all do because it's a hallmark of effective learning, if we want them to engage with peers in providing feedback to each other around the learning, then they're going to do it in relation to the success criteria. What are they doing well, and what do they need to do next in order to meet those success criteria? So they're absolutely foundational to the whole process of formative assessment. And they're one of the fundamental practices that need to be in place in order that everything else can fall into place. So that with clear learning goals, you know what you're teaching, you know what you're learning and why, and then the success criteria, those indicators of performance that both teachers and students are judging. Rose Sadler calls them the reference point. They're the reference point in the lesson against which learning is gauged as that lesson develops and the learning unfolds. So I hope that makes sense in terms of the essential nature of learning goals and success criteria. I remember, just as a little anecdote, actually a state not too far from yours, I was doing a statewide implementation for the Department of Education. And I was at one of the regional centers, and one of these teachers said to me, well, I've tried self-assessment and it doesn't work. So I thought, well, that's a pretty bold statement. So I said, oh, okay, so let's see, well, do the students have criteria against which to judge their performance? And she said, oh, no. And so I had to help her understand that without that, they got no basis for judging the status of their learning and whether they were moving forward or not. So they're absolutely essential. And then the other thing I would say about them, it's critical that there's this common understanding that the student, that it's not just I'm posting the learning goals and the success criteria, but teachers need to take the time for students to really understand what they mean. And it can be done through using examples of strong or weak work, discussing in detail with students, helping them think about it for themselves and rephrase it, reword the success criteria so that teachers are really sure that before they start the learning process that they're very, very clear on what meeting those criteria entail. Sometimes teachers think that, oh, I can't do that at the beginning. I can't do that in the middle of the lesson. It's taking too much time. I've got too much to cover. That's really not the right way to think about it. And as somebody once said to me, it's really going slow to go fast, that you take the time to make sure that students really, really understanding what they're aiming for, they can actually be part of that journey and making determinations about where they are on the journey towards the goal.
You end on the note of saying the journey towards the goal, and that reflects what you said at the beginning of this segment, Margaret, where you said the goals and success criteria are really the drivers of the feedback loop, and
Yes.
that this is working on the lesson level. And so if students understand what they need to know or be able to do when the lesson starts, they will have greater opportunity and greater directly driven path in their learning because they will be able to see where they're going.
Absolutely. And learning isn't, oh, I wish I could remember the quote from Mary Alice White. She says something about, she likens learning to a sea voyage, and where students have got no idea where they're going, they've got no idea what the destination is. So the minutiae of existence, like cleaning the decks or tidying up, become the lived experience rather than fully understanding where the destination is and how they're going to get there.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Margaret, for all the insights you've provided us up to this point. This takes us to how do we provide feedback to our students most effectively to help them to make sense and identify next steps in their learning?
Well, let's first of all be clear about what feedback is. Feedback to students. Feedback to students is not an evaluation. It's not giving them a solution. It's not telling them what to do. The idea of feedback, and this is once again where the success criteria come in, because the feedback needs to be related to the success criteria, is to help students understand what they're doing well in relation to the criteria and what is a potential next step. Now, by a potential next step, I don't mean a solution, I mean a suggestion, a hint. It should be related to thinking and it should have students do the work. If you tell students what the solution is, you've preempted them from actually learning it themselves. Another little anecdote from me is I mentioned I had a career in the UK. And before I moved to the US, I was an inspector of schools for a region of the UK. And one of the things I used to look at in the classroom is who's doing all the work. And I've been a school principal as well 2 or 3 times. So, in fact, 3 times. And that was a similar focus I had for going in the classroom who's doing the work. And it probably doesn't come as any surprise to you that my conclusion in general was it was the teachers doing the work. Now, I think we want students to be doing their work. We want them to be doing the heavy lifting. We're there to support them, but we're not doing the learning for them. And I think that's really, really important to remember when we provide feedback. We want them to do the learning, but we want to give them sufficient support, whether it's a suggestion for how they might think about something, whether it's a further resource they can use, whether it's a clue we can give them, but we're not giving them an answer. We're not giving them the solution. So it's a very sophisticated skill to be able to give feedback. And when it's done well, it can be one of the most powerful things that a teacher can do for student learning. Because the other piece of giving feedback is that students begin to develop a repertoire of learning strategies that then ultimately they can utilize for themselves. They can draw on once they've built up this idea of learning strategies. I've seen this problem before, I've seen a similar problem. How did I solve it then? How can I think about it now? I've seen a similar character in another book behave in this way. I'm predicting that this character might do the same. How did I think about that last time? So these kinds of strategies become part of the student repertoire. But again, we get back to the success criteria as the anchor for the feedback. And then the next thing I would say is that students have to be given time to use the feedback. It's completely useless to give feedback if you are not going to give the students time to use it. And they have to make the decisions. I've seen high school classes when students have got really good at giving each other feedback and receiving teacher feedback, that they actually make decisions as are they going to use the feedback in the way suggested or not? Or has it unlocked another avenue to thinking about their work? But it's different from the feedback that's being given. I've seen that happen in high school classrooms pretty effectively. So the idea is that they must be given time to use the feedback, otherwise, it's pointless. The feedback to improve. So it's improvement oriented feedback that the students can use for themselves in ways that advance their own thinking to help them think about what are the next steps as I'm moving toward meeting the goal.
Yeah, I appreciate you starting with defining the feedback and just really establishing that, and then using the idea of to help us think about defining feedback, like who's doing the work. I think that's a good reference point for us to have when we're providing instruction, and to keep in mind that we are indeed, as teachers, supporting the learning that's occurring versus giving that learning out. And then I also appreciated when you spoke to asking students to take that knowledge and to use the strategies to make the connections in their learning. And you pointed out, and you said this earlier, but a lot of times we don't go slow to go fast, but you pointed out that we need to go slow to go fast. We need to give students that time that they need to make those connections
Mm-hmm.
overall. Yeah.
And one other thing I would add about feedback, it should not be confused with grading. Feedback is not grading. Grades have got nothing to do with feedback because they don't help students know what to do to improve. Grades have a different purpose. It's more of a summative evaluation, but it doesn't tell a student what they need to improve their work. In fact, it tells a student, okay, you're done, you've finished, and that's how students generally receive feedback. The other thing I would add, it's there's very little point providing feedback, written feedback, and grades, because research studies have shown that the students pay attention to the grades and ignore the feedback. And feedback should really be given during the process of learning, not at the end, because you want students to use it in order to keep that learning on track, to keep moving forward. And so, if you're giving feedback at the end, you can say, well, okay, you did this well, you did this well, and that helps with the learning strategies. But it's not as powerful as when you are giving it when they're in the process of trying to learn something. And I'm a big proponent of oral feedback in the moment. You know, teachers are very busy people, and to ask them to do written feedback on student work is really challenging. Where I've seen it work effectively is where teachers are engaging with students in real time and providing feedback based on what they're seeing and hearing during the course of the lesson. That's not to say written feedback isn't helpful and valuable, and there are strategies, and I've written about them, to help manage a large corpus of work and providing feedback. But I think the more you can do it orally in the moment and immediate, the better it is for the teacher and the learner.
You brought up again there the sophisticated interaction. I think that's
Hmm.
also a good way to refer to giving the feedback, whether it be oral or written, as you suggested. But in the very end there, you bring up the grading piece. That is much appreciated because that really does a lot of times short circuit any of this conversation around assessment and feedback in general, especially formatively
Yeah,
going. So thank you for
for
that
sure.
distinction.
We've talked a lot about formative assessment. What resources would you recommend as our listeners look to learn more about formative assessment?
Well, you have some wonderful resources already in Michigan. The Formative Assessment for Michigan Educator program has an awful lot of resources. I think you have to be part of the program to access them, but I would highly recommend that people seek out the program. To me, it's the best model in the country, and it's been supported from the Department of Education for many years now. So they have a lot of resources. The MAC, the Michigan Assessment Consortium, has resources on formative assessment, which I definitely would suggest that you take a look at. I and a colleague just contributed two recently, and there are plenty of others. So there you've got homegrown resources. And then, at the risk of being completely self serving, I do have two books. Well, I have several books, but two I'm mentioning in particular. One is a second edition of a book I wrote in 2010. Well, it was published in 2010, so it meant it was written in 2008. So you can see how the field has developed in the last 12 years or so. Just did a second edition for Corwin, taking in some of the advances that we've now observed through research and through evidence based practices as more teachers around the world are implementing formative assessment. And I also have another one that I wrote for Harvard Education Press, co authored with Caroline Wiley, which is really about a professional continuum for how to think about formative assessment as embedded in the disciplines, because this is very much a focus these days, thinking about the disciplinary nature of formative assessment. You know, questions look different depending on which discipline you're in, for example. And so we're thinking a lot more about the disciplinary nature of formative assessment and then how you support teachers at different stages of their career. Other colleagues have written great books on formative assessments as well, but as this is my show, I'm just going to mention mine.
So just to be clear on those titles, the first one you mentioned FAME project and the MAC, which we have some resources on to share with our listeners. And
Mhm.
then Formative Assessment, Making It Happen in the Classroom is the book that was just released with a second edition.
The second
And
edition.
the second title you named is Formative Assessment in the Disciplines, Framing a Continuum of Professional Learning.
Yes, yes, it is. Which happily the MAC had as one of their reads this year, and I did a session for the MAC on the book. So that was really nice to have responses from Michigan educators in relation to the book. So I appreciated that opportunity.
Thank you for sharing those resources with our listeners.
We've asked some questions and appreciate all the expertise that you have offered. As we conclude this interview, what have we not asked that is important to highlight here?
Well, one thing I think is very important to highlight, and I'm a big proponent of in education being research based, there is a strong research base that supports the use of formative assessment practices in the classroom. And I don't think we should forget that. This isn't a neat idea that Margaret Heritage and a few others or the FAME programs come up with, or it's grounded in a really strong body of research. The landmark review that Paul Black and Dylan William did in 1998 really established formative assessment as an explicit domain of practice in the classroom. And I think since then, although effect sizes have been queried, there's ample empirical data to suggest that formative assessment improves learning. And then the other thing we've had in more recent years is a lot of evidence-based practice from the classroom of what actually happens when teachers implement these processes. And what we learn from across the world, this isn't just us in the US. What we learn from across the world is that kids are more motivated, they learn more, that teachers are more motivated. The number of times I've heard teachers say to me that this has just refreshed their teaching. In fact, one Michigan educator said to me a month ago that she was really burnt out, that she was really thinking about giving up teaching and retiring. She's a veteran teacher. And now she's so energized, she can't believe what's happening to her kids in her classroom, how engaged they are, how much they're learning, how much they want to learn. So I think we can't ignore the empirical base that there is, that formative assessment is good for learners and learning, and we can't ignore the evidence based practice that we now have from all over the world that attests to the benefits of formative assessment for both teaching and learning. So I think we should end by underscoring that there's a solid evidence base that supports the implementation of formative assessment practices in the classroom.
That is a great way to end it with the research and evidence-based. I know our Michigan continuous improvement process that has become more streamlined in the past few years also really requires that in the work that we're doing. And so to highlight that this work isn't just a neat idea, as you said, but is definitely showing a change. And then thank you so much for that story to show the inspiration and the power of this work in an actual Michigan educator.
Mm-hmm.
That's a great reference point for those that are listening audience, that they can take and run with that and hopefully use some of this to maybe start them off on their own journey, something similar to that nature.
Well, it was a pretty powerful statement, I can tell you.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we appreciate your expertise, Margaret. Thank you so much for taking time to share your insights and your thinking. And, I know your partnership with the Michigan Assessment Consortium and the Formative Assessment of Michigan Educators Group, FAME, is also appreciated. And we're excited to see the different professional learning opportunities that they have to learn that work further. But thanks for your partnership with that group and also with us today to better ourselves around this topic of formative assessment and the power that it can bring to our classrooms.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I've really enjoyed talking to you both.
Nice chatting with you too. Thank you. Thank you for joining us for this LLCN Brief podcast today. We appreciate our guest, Miss Margaret Heritage. Thank you for sharing your insight into formative assessment with us. If you're looking to access the resources from today's podcast episode, please visit our electronic document, LLCN 2122 resources at bit.ly/L C lowercase resources 2122.
We look forward to connecting with you again in the near future. Also, we're looking for your suggestions on topics as well as questions you may have related to literacy. Please take the time to let us know what you want to learn more about through the Google form, bit.ly/L C lowercase topics. Thank you for listening today.